Hello everybody and welcome to the latest episode of the Just Football podcast. How are you getting on, guys? Hope everything is well, and thank you for joining us for this episode. On the last show we were joined by Anthony Hayes, who is a youth development coach at Charlton Athletic, and we had a special episode looking at coaching. Today we're moving into the world of the transfer market. The football season is over. The transfer market is now open and we are ready for sort of the deals that are going to come over the summer. It's a completely new environment, new market, and we're going to try and sort of understand it a bit more today in terms of football's future for both clubs and players and where we go from here in this sort of post-COVID environment. And to help us through that and understand this new environment of football, we're delighted to say we're joined by Jonny, who is a sports lawyer at Sheridan's and partner. Jonny, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the invite, and it's great to be on. And yeah, as you said, there's no better time to have a chat about the football industry than the start of a transfer window. So there's certainly no shortage of things to discuss.
Yeah, 100%. And you must be really busy. Obviously, you work for Sheridan's, which is a leading sports and entertainment law firm based in London. You also work across the wider sports and entertainment industry. And just to give a bit of background about Jonny was made a partner of Sheridan's at the age of 29 and was also named in the Sport for Business 30 under 30 of Future Irish Sporting Leaders in 2019, and is also an independent board member of the Northern Ireland Football League. So plenty to discuss, and really pleased to have a sports industry expert really on the show today to sort of thrash through things. Jonny's worked in football has included negotiating player contracts, transfers, sponsorship, endorsement deals, regulatory issues. So really we are in the presence of a bona fide expert today, Jonny. So I've given you the big up there, and I hope I think the first question to maybe start with and to get into it is kind of, that's the blurb, so to speak. That's kind of your background, but maybe tell it in your own words as well. What you do, your day-to-day life, what it involves, and how long you've been doing it. That kind of thing. How did you get into it? That kind of stuff.
You've certainly built up a bit of pressure there, Jonathan, for me to try to follow that. But yeah, I would certainly view myself as being quite fortunate in that I get to combine, my career as a lawyer with working in a sector that ultimately I love and enjoy and I'm passionate about, and that's sport and more broadly entertainment. And I suppose started my career as a solicitor and a lawyer back in Ireland, and the dream was always really to try and pursue a career in sport and the business of sport, and that's something that led me to Sheridan's in London when I moved over from Belfast in 2015. And as you mentioned, Sheridan's is one of probably a small handful of law firms that has specialist teams in sectors such as sport, film and TV, computer games, music, sectors within the entertainment space. And I'm a partner in the sports team, and along with 6 or 7 other lawyers, we work right across the industry, and naturally the size of the football industry is such that a lot of our work focuses around working with players, agents, clubs, leagues, broadcasters, football data companies, anyone really working in and around the football industry. And as you mentioned, that's negotiating contracts, transfers, commercial deals, endorsement deals, sponsorship deals. And then interestingly, the last, I suppose, 4 or 5 months has seen probably a lot of work in relation to all of the legal and commercial issues arising out of the pause button being hit on the football season, and that's been challenging for the industry. And the reality is, every industry and every economy has been hit pretty hard by this pandemic. The football industry really is no different. The football economy has been damaged quite significantly, and whenever we talk about that financial damage, in particular the damage that clubs have suffered from the very, very top of the Premier League right the way down to the lower echelons of the Football League, and in particular in relation to the cuts to income streams and revenue streams that are ultimately so important for clubs to survive and be sustainable. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but particularly those lower league clubs, they're so reliant on their match day revenues, gate receipts, and as well as sponsorship and hospitality as well. And so many of those income streams have been cut really, and that's created huge challenges for clubs and for the wider industry. And ultimately, we're still in a crisis really, and it's easy to sort of get excited by who your club is potentially going to sign in the transfer window over the next 9 or 10 weeks. But the reality is, we're in a very, very difficult, uncertain environment, which is pretty unprecedented for football.
Yeah, 100%, and I think that's probably the first place to start. I mean, there's been announcements today regarding clubs, laying off staff and things like that. So I think there is a context to it all, isn't there? And obviously, we are still living in that kind of new environment. Pandemic is still, it's not even past, is it? We're still in the middle of it, so to speak. So that that context is definitely in mind. But it's certainly it's an industry that carries on, isn't it? It doesn't kind of stop. Football came back obviously in the last few months, and the league seasons have now pretty much finished across Europe. So the next phase really is the Champions League starts off this week, as does the Europa League, to end the sort of European season, and then, like you say, it's kind of transfer season, and it's a new reality for clubs, I imagine. I mean, I suppose the first place to start really from that point of view is, today we're going to talk about kind of the transfer window, how it works, the new financial model, how clubs are making revenue, and maybe how that's going to be impacted, how changes to revenue streams, changes to wages potentially, salary caps, that kind of thing, FFP as well. And we're going to also talk about, the EFL and dip down into sort of the cost of relegation and that kind of thing. The first place to start though really, Jonny, is, we are now in transfer season. That's dominating the headlines at the moment. Obviously, players like Jadon Sancho, there's already been deals like Timo Werner to Chelsea for sort of 49 million roughly. Ferran Torres has just joined Manchester City for I think 25 million or so. From that point of view, what is the new landscape? Because I suppose for a fan just looking at the back pages of a newspaper, it doesn't seem like really much has changed potentially. Given the rumours going about, if you look at Sky Sports News, they've still got their sort of deadline day ticker on the channel. There's a lot of fear around, and there's been a lot of sort of rumours and talks about what's going to happen to the industry. What's your kind of just maybe bullet point analysis of where we are at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you're right in saying that the transfer window has just begun. It runs for 10 weeks until the 5th of October, and in some ways it's business as usual. We've already seen deals being done. Certainly all the top clubs are certainly being linked to a number of different players. So in many ways you could be forgiven for forgetting that we are in a very different environment than what we ordinarily would be at this time of year. In terms of the transfer window itself, it is obviously slightly different this year in that it's a 10-week window running until the 5th of October. Interestingly, we then have a further domestic-only trading window, which will run then for a further 9 or 10 days until the 16th of October. And Premier League clubs will be able to trade with EFL clubs, but not with each other, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And obviously we then have the season starting midway through the window, sometime early to mid-September. So I think it is going to be really fascinating to see how clubs approach the window. And the reality is no one really knows what position each club is in behind the scenes. So it is difficult to predict. In terms of what we're likely to see, again, obviously we can only speculate, but some people would argue that we may see the same volume of deals in this window, but potentially a reduction in value. Others may suggest that clubs could hold off because of the financial uncertainty, and the reality is, no club can be sure of whether supporters are going to be coming into stadiums in October, November, December, January of next year. So therefore, going back to the conversation at the outset about match day revenue, there's so much financial uncertainty around revenue streams and projections that make it very, very difficult for clubs to properly plan. Some people would perhaps suggest that we're going to see maybe more loan deals to EFL clubs compared to previous windows, but again, it's very, very difficult, I think to say and to predict properly. I think history would probably suggest that the top clubs will despite all of the challenges of recent months, that they'll find a budget from somewhere, and it will be business as usual for the likes of Man City, the likes of Chelsea, the likes of Liverpool, and probably Man United as well. I mean, obviously City have already signed a couple of high-profile players. You would expect them to spend big, particularly in light of their successful appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and the fact that they will be in the Champions League next season, which is obviously hugely significant for them, and I'm sure we'll probably come on to that later on.
Yeah.
And obviously Chelsea have already signed Timo Werner, as you mentioned. United are being linked to Sancho. So I think irrespective of the inescapable damage and suffering that every club has faced in recent months, there is an element of business as usual. If we then start to move down the football food chain, there will be greater challenges for those lower league clubs. A really interesting issue, I think, is the fact that a number of clubs have, or certainly are reported to have, agreed pay cuts or certainly wage deferrals with players, and obviously Arsenal is one club that's been mentioned or reported in that category. Now, if clubs who have agreed pay cuts with players then are obviously intending to spend, big money on bringing in new players and strengthening their squad, I think there's an interesting sort of political, ethical discussion there around how clubs justify doing so, which I think is going to be very, very, very interesting. But the reality is, I think it comes back to the point at the top of the discussion, the financial uncertainty for clubs around match day revenue going forwards this season.
Yeah,
and testing and everything else just make it very, very difficult to predict how clubs will behave in this window.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if we look at it from a financial point of view, if you look at accounts for clubs going back to sort of 2017, for example, 2018, as a base example, clubs tend to make a lot more money from broadcasting deals. I think the last, Liverpool, for example, made about 150 million from broadcasting rights, 73 million from match day income, and 136 million from commercial deals. So if you split that up, I suppose at the moment matchday revenue for Premier League clubs is kind of the lower. They get double the amount in broadcasting rights. So that, I suppose, explains the importance of ending the season, doesn't it? If you look at what are you seeing in the industry at the moment from your work point of view and your own thoughts in terms of the impact of lack of matchday revenue? I mean, there's no real announcements of when fans will be allowed back in stadiums yet. Is it sort of like not that big to Premier League clubs to lose that income? I mean, obviously, relatively it is big, but
yeah, it's a really interesting discussion, that, because I think you're right to draw that distinction between, if we take the top four clubs in the Premier League, who ultimately for them match day income is probably the small. In fact, it certainly is the smallest revenue earner overall, and for them broadcasting revenue and sponsorship revenue will, to a large extent, mitigate for the loss of that match day income. So you could say that the financial model of City, United, Liverpool and Chelsea is a lot more pandemic proof or COVID proof than a club sitting in the Championship, League One or League Two or Scotland or elsewhere. Now, having said that, if you then look to a club like Arsenal, I mean, I think it was reported in the Telegraph today that their position maybe isn't as healthy as you might expect. I think they were reported to have made 55 redundancies today, and apparently that they're the Premier League club most affected by fans not being in stadiums, and I think they're potentially going to lose over £800 million in total because of the proportion of their revenue being match day. Yeah. So that shows you that a club of Arsenal's stature, having just won another FA Cup, is still sort of taking a pretty significant hit based on everything that's happened. And then I suppose if we go further down the football pyramid, for many EFL clubs, match day revenue could equate to 40% or more of their total income streams, and that is hugely significant. Yeah. And bearing in mind that the pause button was hit back in March, April, which is a long time ago. Yeah. So it's important to to not forget that this is a financial crisis for the football economy and the football industry, just like it is for hospitality and education, so many other different industries in society.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on that. I mean, is it, Arsenal's revenues, is that down to the fact that they just make more money from match day revenue, and that's why it's such a big impact on them, or why is it because of the maybe lack of success on the field in recent years? Obviously, Europa League football, is that a driver of that, or do you have a theory behind that in terms of just specifically to Arsenal at this moment in time, given the news?
It's a really interesting question, actually, because if we take Arsenal as a top Premier League club, they haven't been in the Champions League for a number of seasons. Now, yes, they still benefit from Europa League prize money. But the reason why Man City were so, I'm sure, relieved and delighted to have the ban overturned at CAS, the reason why Man United were so relieved and Chelsea so relieved to secure top four, is because qualifying for the Champions League is so significant from a financial perspective. And if you have a look at the Champions League distribution figures from last season, so the 18-19 season, and these are available on the UEFA website, you automatically get, I think, €14.5 million if you become one of the 32 qualified clubs. You then pick up something like €2.7 million for every group stage win, and the further you progress in the competition, that prize money will increase. So additional prize money of something like $9.5 million for last 16, and that continues to increase up to the semi-finals and the final, and winning the competition. And all of that doesn't include your commercial revenue and your match day revenue from big Champions League games. There's then obviously a TV pool of monies and UEFA coefficient monies. So you've got all sorts of drivers to ensure that you as a club secure Champions League football.
Yeah.
There's also, interestingly, a clause reportedly in the Adidas Manchester United contract that says if a club doesn't qualify for 2 years in a row for the Champions League, then there may be a reduction in that deal. The same could apply for other clubs and other commercial partnership deals. And then you've got the recruitment aspect as well, in that if you're not a Champions League club, attracting the best players in this current climate is going to be pretty difficult. Yeah. So I suppose, going back to your question, not being a Champions League club over a period of time may be a significant factor for Arsenal, but I'm sure there are others as well. I mean, they've done an excellent job of probably maximising the fan experience on a Saturday and maximising what they get from hospitality, sponsorship and other match day revenue, as well as gate receipts. So there are a number of factors, I would imagine, in the mix. Yeah, I mean,
Premier League clubs in total transfer expenditure, in 2018, I believe, was a record £2.4 billion, which was an increase of 47%, incredibly. I guess that we can't expect it to hit those sort of figures this year. You would imagine. Do you expect to see sort of more loan deals and things like that in your work because of that, or do you think more swap deals, that kind of thing, more free transfers? And how, maybe if you were forecasting, how big a dip do you think it'll be from that maybe 2.4 billion pound figure?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and again, I think a lot of that will depend on what clubs outside of the top four are prepared to do and what their appetite is to perhaps take some risks in the next sort of 2 months. I think it's a really difficult window to predict, because I think we've a fair idea what top clubs will do, but in relation to a club sitting in the Championship or League One, they'll be looking at their projections for the next few months. They'll be looking at their wage bill. They'll be looking at whether they can do more activity when it comes to loan deals. But the elephant in the room is there's a big black cloud hanging over you as a club in relation to the damage of the last number of months and the fact that you may not have fans inside your stadium for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. I mean, only 2 clubs in the most recent kind of annual reports actually reduced their wage costs. Swansea City and Newcastle. Manchester United at the moment with a £296 million wage bill continue to be the league's highest sort of payers, but their actual wages to ratio wages to revenue turnover ratio is only 50%. So you could argue that maybe that explains why they can afford to sort of go in for a Sancho at 100 million, because maybe relative to their revenue it's sustainable. Whereas, you know, we've seen that wage costs in the Premier League have grown by 15% in 2018, reaching record figures, and I think that's something we'll talk about later in the show in terms of the Football League impact, because there's so many clubs who have gone into huge debt because of that. But I suppose the question, you know, moving forward is, in what you're seeing day to day, you know, do you envisage a major change to wages? Do you think, like, for example, salary caps, are they on the table? There's meant to be votes, I think, in the Football League at this moment in time. You know, from that point of view, do you think the bubble is kind of going to burst? Because I think there's probably a perception from the outside that, you know, it's maybe unsustainable in terms of the amount of wages players are getting, that kind of thing.
Yeah, again, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, you know, we're in pretty unprecedented times in that no club planned or could really have foreseen what was going to happen in the last number of months, in that they weren't going to play any games, certainly from League One down, I suppose. They weren't going to play any games, you know, with a number of games left in the season. So it's incredibly difficult for anyone to sort of predict where the industry is going to go from here, given that everyone is still really trying to sort of play catch up on what has happened the last few months. Yeah. And the reality is, you know, the current, you know, COVID-19 landscape means that we don't really have any visibility as to, you know, what levels of testing will be available whenever the new season starts. Obviously, we know that will probably happen at the Premier League level, but outside of that, it's impossible to predict. So when it comes to a club looking to sort of trim its wage bills, you know, the reality is that that's probably inevitable, because ultimately, if a club or any business for that matter needs to cut costs, the first or the primary way of doing that is probably cutting your wage bills. Now, the reality is, if you're a club in the Championship, you want your wage bill to be as high as possible to maximise your chance of securing promotion to the Premier League.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's possible that actually your non-playing staff will be the unlucky ones who will potentially be made redundant, and that's where you'll be cutting costs. Again, going back to what you mentioned about Arsenal, you know, it was reported today that they've made 55 redundancies, a number of which, or perhaps the majority of which, are in relation to, you know, non-playing staff or non-footballing staff.
Yeah.
So, you know, a football club is ultimately a business which needs to make at times very difficult decisions in relation to how to cut costs, and those decisions, I think, will inevitably have to be made over the coming weeks, transfer window or no transfer window.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a delicate, you know, from my personal point of view, I think it's going to be a delicate situation for clubs, because at the same time as they don't maybe rely on matchday revenue and fans going to games at this moment in time as much as they do commercial deals and broadcast deals, I think there's a fine balance between maybe turning fans off from the game. I think 55 redundancies and that kind of thing, whilst still bidding for players on free transfers on rumoured, you know, 200 grand a week and that kind of thing is I think probably quite hard to sort of swallow for some fans, and I think maintaining the attractiveness of the league is going to be a massive challenge, in my opinion, for certain clubs, because at the end of the day, the more fans you turn off from the game, you know, who maybe looks at other areas of the game, maybe lower leagues or whatever, if they don't like what they're seeing on the pitch, or they can't stomach it, then that also will have an impact on your ability to attract, you know, broadcasting deals, won't it, and commercial deals. So I think it's definitely a balancing act between, you know, obviously protecting the club, but also then protecting your image as well as a brand, maybe, and doing the socially responsible thing as well. So as you say,
I think you're absolutely right about that. But I think the other point to make is that the one thing we have seen in sport generally, and I suppose entertainment, is that fans don't disappear off and go away. You know, that they stay loyal and they stay passionate through pandemics and through recessions as well, and that we may enter a recession and it may be difficult for football fans, but the reality is they will stay loyal to their football club. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity for clubs to be creative around not so much how they commercialise their fan base, but how they, you know, keep their fans engaged. And there's all sorts of online digital activations that we've seen recently from clubs being really innovative as a way of trying to give fans the connections that they want to the team and to players without physically sitting in the stadium.
Do you have some examples of that? Because obviously I know you do a bit of work in esports, and I think during the lockdown I kind of delved into esports and was looking at things like Twitch and things like that. Do you have some examples of how clubs are looking to engage fans maybe off the pitch, or where you see that going?
There's so many really good examples. I mean, one is actually just using players very sensibly and very creatively and very well. And then you mentioned esports, and what we've seen in the last probably 3 or 4 months is an increased convergence between not just the football industry but also, I suppose, traditional sports and traditional sectors, and then this booming world of esports. And I think a number of people were very clever in recognising that actually we can use esports and video games as a way of actually getting even closer connections with our fans. I mean, one example that I thought was genius was Leyton Orient Football Club. And they were so quick off the mark. As soon as the EFL season was pretty much halted, they announced that they were going to host an online FIFA 20 tournament. I think they called it Optimum Quarantine. And very quickly they ended up having like 128 clubs from around the world competing in this online esports event. Now, from a fan engagement perspective, that is incredibly simple but unbelievably effective. And what sort of esports I think represents for football is this potential to sort of not just engender a new group of fans, but actually just make your product more entertaining and more engaging. Because the reality is you have this enormous audience that is incredibly engaged by esports and video games content. As a football club, tap into that and look at sort of creative ways of doing that. So that's just one example, but there've been loads of examples during lockdown of actually players using their downtime to sort of showcase their love of gaming, whether it be streaming or online competitive gaming. I mean, we saw Dele Alli was doing it, Kevin De Bruyne, those guys were playing Fortnite, raising money for charity. Gareth Bale, Jordan Pickford. I mean, there's a whole host of players who are, looking at creative ways of doing that. So, I think there's a big opportunity there for clubs to recognise that actually you don't have to commercialise your fan base by selling them tickets and shirts and scarves and merchandise. There are other ways of engaging them and other ways of trying to attract commercial partners and brands as well.
Yeah, I think you raise a really, really good point there. And one of the things I saw as well, just to add to that, is Olympique Marseille. They've been streaming their pre-season friendlies on Twitch, which I think their first pre-season friendly against it's like quite a low-level club had like 100,000 viewers, which obviously shows you the size of the club, but also the size of the platform, to maybe attract new fans. So it's a really interesting point you raised there. On the subject of players, and we saw like Marcus Rashford and players like that kind of doing really good things during the lockdown to socially responsible things and using their platforms to speak for good. Do you think that's something that's going to happen more often from your point of view? Because I suppose the reality of it is it's also whilst it's like very responsible and a good human thing to do for players, it also has a commercial appeal to it, doesn't it? Because if you look at Rashford, for example, he's on the cover of Vogue now. He's I'm pretty sure his phone's going to be ringing quite a lot. We've seen Raheem Sterling in talks with huge brands to do different campaigns. So his commercial appeal since he spoke out against racism, a year or so ago, has really sort of blown up. What do you see in that space from a sports law point of view, an entertainment point of view, in your day-to-day work?
I think it's a really interesting point you make, and I suppose what I'm seeing is a couple of things. First of all, a shift in how not just football players but traditional athletes and traditional sporting talent are being viewed by fans and by brands and by the industry. And you mentioned Marcus Rashford as a great example, and there are a host of others. These players are they're more than just high-performing machines on the field of play. They're human beings with beliefs and values, and they're activists as well. And Rashford's the classic example of that. The other case study that I like to use is Hector Bellerin. Hector is 25 years of age, just won his third FA Cup there. He's an international player. He's had a hugely successful career already. But he's also someone who has regularly spoken out about climate change and mental health. He's addressed the Oxford Union. He's appeared, I think he was the first footballer ever to appear at Paris Fashion Week.
Yep.
He's started a company, he's got an online marketing diploma. Perhaps he is an anomaly, and perhaps he is he's the outlier. But I actually think he's perhaps leading the way as an example, along with Rashford and others, as being this new breed of footballers who are incredibly appealing to brands, because they are human beings with views and with incredibly powerful voices that can, be really, really engaging through all of those innovative sort of digital activations. So I think, what am I saying? I'm seeing a shift in how footballers are being viewed, but also I'm seeing a shift in how actually that content is being packaged up and used. And we've seen so many really sort of cool, innovative brand campaigns involving these types of players that if it's done well, can be really, really engaging, especially when there's no football on the field of play, which is what we've had obviously for a period of the last 6 months. Yeah,
and I have to say, I really I think it was a great moment when Jadon Sancho, for example, spoke out and had a T-shirt when he was playing with Dortmund. The Black Lives Matter, supporting Black Lives Matter, and a lot of players have come out, and I think that was I found it a really touching moment. And I think you're right. There's a new generation of players who have kind of grown up in the social media era, and they're not going to put up with the injustices that maybe they've seen as they've grown up. The kids these days grow up with the internet, don't they? And they see these things, and I think it's really encouraging that they're using their voice so early in their careers already, kind of having an awareness of the world as well as being elite athletes to kind of speak up. And certainly if I was managing a player or speaking with a player, I would advise, or any players listening to this, I would definitely say kind of speak your truth, tell your story and be authentic. And I think that there's benefits to that on both sides, both in terms of just being real and just being a good human being, but also I think it actually leads to potential commercial benefits as well, like you say. I mean, let's move on to sort of, I'm really intrigued about your work, and I'm sure, I know there's certain things you can't say maybe, but I'd like to know, for those listeners who probably want to know a little bit about sports law and how it works in terms of transfers themselves, how they get done. I mean, the big talk, one of the big talking points of this week is sort of Jadon Sancho to Manchester United, and there's been media leaks and briefs, and it seems to take so long, particularly when it's United involved. But in general, transfers do take so long, don't they? From a sports law perspective, how do these big deals get done? What are the triggers? Why do they seem to sort of take so long? What's if you could briefly talk about, before we move on to the Champions League and that kind of thing, if you could briefly talk about your work in that and what actually happens for those who want some sort of inside knowledge of how transfers take place and that kind of thing. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, that's a question that perhaps unsurprisingly we get asked quite a lot, which is actually why do transfers take so long to get over the line, and B, actually what are the different components that make up a transfer. And actually I'm going to make a bit of a shameless plug for a colleague of mine, Daniel G, who I'm sure a few people listening will be familiar with. Daniel's a partner in the sports team at Sheridan as well, and he's written a book called Done Deal, which is effectively an insider's guide to the football industry. And there's a chapter in that book on effectively the transfer market and what makes up a transfer. And it's actually really a really neat guide to all of the different issues that we're talking about. How I would tend to describe it is that there are so many different moving parts and so many different cogs that make up the wheel, and ultimately they all need to fit together for a deal to cross the line. And some of those moving parts are obviously the transfer agreement between the buying and selling club, and then the playing contract itself, with a host of different bonus provisions, performance clauses, whether that be winning trophies, securing top four, promotion, and then individual achievements like appearances or goals. You've then got the image rights contract between the club and the player, and that will typically be in place with any players who have sufficient commercial value to offer to commercial partners. And obviously you need to make sure that the club's sponsorship or commercial partnership arrangements don't conflict with a player's individual commercial arrangements. So there's often some negotiation needed there. And then you have to bear in mind that you're negotiating with agents who are acting in their client's best interest, but they're obviously advising both player and also selling club and others involved in the deal. Another factor to consider in all of that is the fact that often a transfer is part of a chain of deals that are all linked to each other and are all dependent on each other.
Yeah, of course.
And if one of those transfers falls through, then that will have a knock-on effect. And then from a lawyer perspective, you've got all of the paperwork and documentation that needs to be put in place when it comes to international transfers. You've got work permits that can often cause a bit of a headache as well. So there's 5 or 6 of probably a dozen different cogs in the wheel, to use that analogy.
If you had to,
and you can see that all it takes is one of those to break down, and that sort of jeopardizes things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the examples Dan mentions in his book, and that there's numerous that you could talk about, and I'm sure you'll remember this well, Jonathan, as a United fan. But the David De Gea transfer to Real Madrid back in 2015, deadline day I think it was. He was all set to move from United to Real Madrid for 30 million, I believe it was. And what basically happened was the correct documentation wasn't uploaded to the FIFA transfer matching system at the time, and the deal collapsed, and there was a bit of an unpleasant fallout as a result. So ultimately it's very different to what it's sometimes portrayed as, and often the media will present it as being a straightforward process of club identifies player, negotiates a deal is finalised, and everyone moves on, when actually, certainly in our experience, there are often weeks and months of planning, negotiation, strategy, discussions behind the scenes to get to a point where actually all of those moving parts can fit together and a deal can be done.
I mean, if there's one thing that keeps you up most at night in your work, what would you say of those sort of, like you say, 5, 6, 7 moving parts? Is there one thing that you always find always the hardest part, or is it literally all of them are? It can be anything in a deal that takes ages. From you, is it drafting things? Is it trying to get the image rights deal sorted out? What's probably the one thing where you would say, time after time, holds you up in your work when these deals are done?
It's a really good question. I mean, I wish there was only one thing that kept me awake at night when it comes to these deals. I mean, often your brain is going into overdrive, because actually, I think the answer to that question is you're probably scared of forgetting something, or forgetting one of those elements, because if you do, then obviously that could have an effect on the wider sort of commercial deal. I mean, one of the things that is often maybe not fully appreciated is actually the level of nuance that goes into some of these agreements. So if we take the transfer agreement itself between the buying and selling club, often those transfer fees are in installments.
Yeah.
And there will be a sell-on clause as well. There will be potentially add-on compensation for particular, achievements being hit. But you might have, 50% payable once the transfer is completed, and then 25% after year 1, and then 25%, the transfer fee after year 2. So if you're talking about let's just say it's a £120 million transfer, which is not going to be, out of the ordinary anytime soon. Only maybe 80 million of that might be guaranteed, and that could be payable in 4 installments. And actually, the remaining 30 or 40 million could be contingent on certain achievements, whether it be winning trophies or succeeding in particular competitions. Yeah. So, often, that's just one example of some of the nuances that sit behind how a transfer deal is often portrayed. I mean, another one is, the deal or the agreement between the buying club and the player. You've obviously got a negotiation there in relation to what the player's weekly wage is going to be, and you'll know this well, John. Plus the signing on fee.
Yeah, sure.
Plus loyalty and performance bonuses. And ultimately, there's a negotiation there in relation to what the base salary is going to be and what all of those different performance-related provisions will be. Certainly one of the trends in the industry over the last number of years has been probably a lower base salary with a higher performance-related pay, which creates a number of really interesting sort of issues in relation to potentially clubs having then large bonus liabilities. So that's another sort of nuance. And then, another one again would be the image rights contract that I mentioned earlier between the club and the player. Often there's a fairly significant amount of work that will need to go into locking in that deal.
Yeah.
And then obviously you've got agents' commission as well that needs to be paid and should be paid. And obviously there's some work that needs to go into that. So I think I'd be wrong to say that there are easy parts to it, and then there's one or two sort of more difficult parts. The reality is it's a complex web of contractual arms and legs,
for sure,
that ultimately all need to be tied together within a short space of time, because clearly there are deadlines at play, not just transfer window deadlines, but also often there's a limited window to actually get a deal done based on what selling club or buying club or player's agent are willing to entertain.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say, sort of in a sentence or so, what would you say makes a good sports lawyer then? From that point of view, there's so many moving parts to nail these kind of huge £100 million transfers. And I mean, it sounds like a fair amount of pressure in your work, and it takes someone with real, I guess, attention to detail and skill to be part of those things. What would you say, let's just say for a trainee lawyer or someone who wants to get into the industry, what would you say is the key skills that you might need in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. I mean, I think a lot of what we do, not just in the context of negotiating transfers, but actually negotiating, contracts and deals within the sports industry, consist of not just the law and legal issues, but actually more broadly finding commercial solutions to things. And often our job feels a little bit like we are constantly trying to find a solution to a new problem that has arisen and a new roadblock that has arrived.
Yeah.
And ultimately that requires a number of things. It requires the ability to step back from sometimes complex deals and actually recognise what the client's objective is. So if you're advising a player or an agent or a club, what is the objective commercially? What do we want to get out of this deal? At what point do we want to walk away from the deal? And then trying to find solutions to particular issues that arise.
Sure.
You mentioned attention to detail, and the reality is, in all of the issues that we've talked about in the last 5-10 minutes, you've got to have your eye on the ball, and ultimately, if there is something that probably keeps me awake at night, and I'm sure I speak for the other guys in the team at Sheridan as well, it's making sure that you have, the everything in order and all of the detail looked after, and ultimately as well, in terms of the core skills that I've learned that you probably need to sort of progress in your career. It's the ability to communicate and deal with other people, because ultimately I would say that the sports industry, more so than perhaps other sectors, is about dealing with people.
Yeah.
Because, the vast majority of people that I've met who work in sport, sport is more than just business to them. It's their lives, it's their interests, it's their passions, it's their football club, it's their it's very personal to them.
Yeah.
And that means that all of the dealings that you have and the negotiations that you have and the discussions that you have, you're dealing with people who are very passionate and who care deeply about the subject area. Yeah. And that means you have to be sensitive to that, and you have to have really good communication skills, and that's something that I think is a real positive. But it's also important that you're sensitive to that as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like you mentioned the network and that kind of thing. Maybe networking is a bit of advice there that you would give. I mean, I really appreciate that. And let's move on to the final part of this show, which is we're going to talk about the sort of lower leagues a little bit, because I think if we're looking at this episode, understanding the new transfer market, that is probably the one area where there will be significant changes. There will be significant impacts. As you've mentioned, matchday revenue makes up a much higher percentage of income for those clubs. So I want to look at that. Let's start with sort of Bournemouth maybe and the relegated teams. We'd imagine there'd be more drastic impacts of COVID on that. How bad will the situation be for the relegated clubs? And do you think they'll have to sell players to survive that lack of revenue? Is it going to, obviously there's parachute payments. We've seen Fulham go up, and they've had the benefit of those parachute payments. What's the outlook maybe lower down the leagues that you've seen for EFL clubs and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue and a really interesting question. I mean, again, I would probably point to someone who probably is much better versed in the financial implications of relegation than me, and that's Twitter handle with the name at Swiss Ramble.
Yeah,
he's outstanding because he effectively breaks down the revenue streams for lots of different types of clubs throughout the entire football hierarchy, including relegated clubs. And I think he sent a few tweets out quite recently on that. You mentioned Bournemouth as a really good example. The reality is, in being relegated from the Premier League to the Championship, their revenue will inevitably decrease following relegation. Based on what we've seen in recent seasons, on average that could be in and around 50%, right, which could amount to potentially a decrease of maybe £60 million in some cases. Now, the most significant revenue decrease is, unsurprisingly, in relation to broadcasting revenue. And that is, hugely significant because there is this massive gap between what you're going to get as a Premier League club and what you're going to get as a Championship club. Yeah. And ultimately, the Championship TV deal, pales in insignificance really compared to the Premier League. You've also then got commercial revenue, whether that be shirt sponsorship, match day revenue that we've talked about, which will be, even greater this season because of the potential lack of footfall due to the pandemic. So that could be potentially, another £5 million. Interestingly, clubs will then likely have outstanding transfer instalments owed to other clubs. And I think Bournemouth are certainly one of those clubs. And I think it was quoted as being around £80 million for the 18-19 season. And again, you should check out the Swiss Ramble Twitter feed. So ultimately, you've got a significant drop in revenue. Now, you mentioned parachute payments. There's absolutely no question that parachute payments are very, very helpful in cushioning the fall, to put it that way. So in the first season after relegation, you might get potentially £45 to £50 million, and then further payments due over a 3-year period amounting to maybe £100 million. But the reality is that only goes so far. And if we put all of that together, whether you're a Bournemouth or any other club for that matter getting relegated from the Premier League, your income is going to drop significantly, potentially 50% or more. And in some ways that goes back to the conversation we had earlier on in a discussion in relation to then the need to cut costs, because any business whose income has been slashed in that way will inevitably need to find ways of cutting costs. The starting point is, unsurprisingly, probably revisiting your wage bill. Yeah. The difficulty is, as we all know, you want to keep your playing budget as high as possible to maximise your chances of getting back out of the championship. So potentially then it's non-playing staff who may be the unlucky ones. Now another interesting issue that is often overlooked is the fact that often players will have relegation clauses in their contracts.
Yeah.
Now that isn't always the case, and the example I always like to think of is Jack Rodwell.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be lots of people who will have watched the Sunderland documentary.
Yeah.
He was signed on like 70k a week or something, and he stayed on that money when he was relegated to the Championship, and he continued to earn. I think everyone would probably agree a small fortune when he was when the club was then relegated again to League One. So clubs will inevitably look to relegation clauses to try and mitigate risk. However, if you're an agent and you're advising a player in that position, you're probably going to push back on that.
Yeah. 100%.
So, inevitably, it's not going to be quite as straightforward as just putting a relegation clause in there and away you go.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a flavour of the reality for relegated clubs, and I think that reality is all the more, stark this time around because of the added pressure of coming out of the back of a pandemic and the uncertainty in relation to revenue streams going forward.
Yeah, I mean, they call it the £180 million game. I don't know how many times we hear that every single year, don't we? But I think, just for a bit of wider context on it, I think you've mentioned there as well, finishing bottom of the Premier League typically can earn you around £90 million just from being in the league and the sort of broadcasting and distribution of prize money and things like that. Then there's the sort of parachute payments, as you mentioned. Sponsorship can be declined by about sort of 20 to 30% maybe, and match day revenue can also decline by about 20 to 30%, maybe even 50%. I think the average match day revenue in the Championship is 6 million compared to Premier League is between 7 and 16 million. So clearly there's a massive dip there, and as you say, clubs are going to have to be really careful. I mean, the salary cap has been talked about a lot. Do you think? I mean, I would imagine it's anti-competitive in terms of the EU. I can't see how that's going to pass. Potentially, I think there's going to be all kinds of challenges to that to try and restrict it. And I've already seen some pushback from clubs, bigger clubs in say League One or League Two against it. Do you? I mean, there's been a lot of rumours of, QPR, for example, selling Eberechi Eze on Just Football. We just had today our latest video analysis on Ivan Toney, which you can check out on our YouTube channel or JF Analytics. He's linked to sort of Celtic and Rangers and those kind of clubs. I think it probably... Is it fair to say it's a sense now that clubs are going to have to sell their best assets and kind of rely on youth players for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we're potentially entering a recession. So, there are going to be all sorts of challenges for businesses within industries such as sport that ultimately relies on gate receipts and revenue on match day. I mean, the whole issue of salary cap is, we could probably have several podcasts, episodes themselves just on that very issue, and we could widen it to talking about salary caps in the context of other sports as well. And there are a lot of interesting legal arguments around that, unsurprisingly too. You mentioned earlier on about the Man City decision and financial fair play as well. I mean, the reality is, financial fair play and the regulations that UEFA have in place, they were brought in with the objective of trying to increase the self-sustainability of football clubs and help clubs live within their means. And actually, despite the City decision and despite what some people might say, actually, if we look at the data, that objective has by and large been achieved over the last probably 10 years, shall we say. Yeah. But the reality is, I think there's a wider discussion to be had about actually how we can make EFL clubs and we can extend this discussion probably to Scotland and Wales and Ireland and other countries in Europe as well, how we can make those clubs more financially sustainable.
Yeah,
whether that's in relation to how broadcasting revenue is distributed, whether that's in relation to how we regulate transfers, whether that's in relation to salary caps, as you mentioned. I think there is a much wider conversation here to be had about what the industry can be doing to try and ultimately better safeguard the financial health of these clubs.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, on that actually, on FFP, we've got a few more questions before we wrap up. Obviously, really enjoyed talking to you. Time seems to have flown. Do you think, is FFP dead? I mean, everyone knows the verdict. Manchester City, obviously, in that case of being banned from the Champions League and that kind of thing, they've been reinstated. From that point of view, a lot of people say, well, that's the end of FFP, and financial fair play now will no longer apply, and I guess it's a really long conversation to go into, so to maybe try and keep it brief, I guess. But is it the end of FFP as we know it, or was that kind of an overblown sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that the Court of Arbitration for Sport award, which obviously led to City being successful, the award itself was 93 pages long. So keeping any conversation brief when you're talking about this decision is challenging.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
It is, because of all of the different issues that were involved. But I think in trying to be as brief as possible, ultimately, one of the key issues in that decision was ultimately whether UEFA was correct in saying that Manchester City's owners had disguised or artificially inflated sponsorship income as a way of getting around or circumventing the rules or regulations on financial fair play. And ultimately, UEFA were saying that City had provided incorrect information in relation to this disguised equity funding through sponsors. Court of Arbitration for Sport said this allegation from UEFA was not proven, and actually UEFA had failed to establish that these payments had actually come from City's parent company, and also the Court of Arbitration for Sport said that some of these allegations or these alleged breaches from UEFA, or that UEFA had been arguing, were time barred, because they had effectively occurred more than 5 years before UEFA charged the club. Now, what maybe not everyone who hasn't read the full 93 pages maybe doesn't necessarily appreciate is, ultimately those are very narrow grounds for City's appeal to be upheld and for UEFA's arguments to be effectively dismissed. City were still found to be in breach of the FFP regulations because they failed to cooperate with the UEFA investigation. So going to your question about, is this the end of financial fair play and should it be scrapped? My personal view is that I don't think it should be, because going back to what I said a few minutes ago, the ultimate objective of FFP was to help clubs be more financially sustainable and live within their means, and the data would suggest that has happened. I mean, club losses back in 2010 was like, I don't know, 1.7 billion euros or something like that. Fast forward to 2020 and we're seeing pretty significant profits, and obviously cumulative debt has fallen, and wage bills have become more closely aligned to revenue. So yes, there are question marks over the regulations perhaps and their enforceability, and perhaps some of the time limits that exist should be revisited. And I would imagine that UEFA probably will revisit those regulations in light of what has happened. But my personal view is that City's appeal was successful on relatively narrow grounds, rather than being based solely on the evidential thresholds, which would be slightly different. So has the credibility of FFP been damaged? Perhaps slightly, but certainly not, I think, to the extent that some people maybe make out. I'm conscious that you wanted a short answer, and I've given you probably a very long-winded answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think you're right. Maybe we'll have to organise another episode or something like that, because that's one that we could talk about all day, and it's hard to probably condense. But yeah, it seems like clear that you still think there's a place for it, and ensuring the financial safety of clubs is probably not a bad idea given the situation, especially if you look at the EFL, which we touched on there, where so many clubs have kind of gone insolvent or into administration and things like that. There's real challenges, I think, for the lower levels of the game, certainly, to stay financially responsible and healthy. We're going to wrap it up with one final question about yourself, Jonny. Thanks so much for your time. You're also on the board of the Northern Ireland Football League, and you've got a passion for Northern Irish football. Obviously, I'm sure most people by now, hearing your accent, will know that you're from Northern Ireland. Tell us about that as well. Obviously you're really passionate about football, like myself, and I've known you for a while, and I know your passion for the game. Tell us about that, and also, I suppose, the challenges of being on a board of a league that's sort of trying to grow, and how you balance that with your day-to-day work.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating, eye-opening experience, I suppose, and really interesting, wearing a different hat and putting on sort of a league perspective rather than a club hat or a player agent hat. I mean, how it came about, it was, I think, last November when I joined the board as a sort of independent board member, and it's a really interesting league because the product has improved exponentially in recent years. I mean, it's an incredibly exciting product in that it's a very competitive league. Clubs are performing better in Europe than they ever have before. Clubs in England and Scotland are, viewing the Northern Ireland Football League as a really attractive market for young players. I mean, we're seeing, a number of players in the last couple of weeks being picked up by EFL clubs. So the quality and the standard of football is continuing to increase. We're seeing investment into certain clubs. Larne and Glentoran would be two examples of clubs who have had investment in the last couple of years, which is a real positive, I think, for the league as well. So actually, there's been a really sort of good success story. The reality is, though, there are challenges for any smaller tier or lower tier domestic league.
Yeah.
In that, first of all, how do you generate revenue for your league? And that's a big challenge. Where does the Premier League get most of its revenue from? Broadcasting. It's no real surprise that the Northern Ireland Football League doesn't get a huge amount of revenue from broadcasting, just like so many other sort of smaller leagues across Europe. There are also challenges when it comes to trying to get your top clubs progressing further in Europe to enable the league to grow. And in some ways it is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, because one of the challenges is the fact that whenever Northern Ireland's clubs compete in the Champions League or the Europa League qualifying rounds in July, or certainly in a normal season it would be July, they end up facing clubs from elsewhere in Europe who are in the peak of their season rather than being in pre-season. So there's arguably a disadvantage there for our clubs. When I say our clubs, the clubs in the Northern Ireland Football League. So I think there are so many opportunities to try and be innovative when it comes to trying to grow the product and trying to attract brand partners and I think outside the box a little bit. But there are also real challenges as well, and Northern Ireland aren't alone. I mean, the same will apply to so many other leagues. But the reality is it's been a really interesting sort of role for me, because you're putting on a slightly different hat, and you're trying to ultimately add some value based on what I see across the water in England and Scotland.
Yeah, definitely.
And trying to sort of offer innovative ideas to see if there are ways of trying to move things forward. Yeah,
for sure. And I think the challenge, as I see it for those sort of leagues, I've done a lot of work in the sort of non-league as well, and that's always a question, is kind of trying to position itself, isn't it, as well? There's things like the calendar and the summer sort of playing of games, all that kind of thing, and UEFA coefficient, the importance of like European football. There's so many debates you could have around that, probably for Northern Ireland. We could have another whole show about that, to be honest. But no, it's just interesting to get a little bit of insight into your role on the board there and understand it. So yeah, Jonny, thanks so much for your time. It's been a really good hour or so. I hope it's provided value for listeners. And yeah, it's been great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to chat. And thanks again for the invite.
Yeah, hopefully it gives a bit of background and context to the transfer window and understanding, the new sort of reality for players and clubs and where we are and where we're going to go in the future. I think, Jonny, you've been really great with time, and do check out Sheridan Sport and also at Jonny Madel07 on Twitter to follow, and we'll post the links on social media as well. Follow at Just Football on Twitter, and do subscribe to the podcast as well, and please share it or spread the word if you enjoy it. And we'll be back with more episodes in the coming weeks. So this has been a really good conversation, and like I said, I hope it provides value for you, and we will be back soon. So Jonny, once again, thanks so much for your time. That's about it for this show this week. Guys, thanks for listening. Goodbye.